The sharp morning light glinted off the silver Rolex on James Harper's wrist as he leaned against his Ferrari, flanked by his brothers Michael and Christopher. The three Harper heirs cut imposing figures in the quaint farmers' market that had sprung up on the outskirts of Westlake Village, an exclusive enclave where their family mansion stood as a landmark of generational wealth. Their casual designer clothes, worth more than what most vendors here made in months, marked them as outsiders, tourists among the working class. "Father said we need to reconnect with reality," James mimicked their father's gruff voice, earning chuckles from his brothers. As if spending a Saturday morning watching peasants sell produce would somehow make us better board members. At 27, James was the oldest and most cynical of the three, with dark hair swept back from a face that graced business magazines under headlines like "America's Most Eligible Corporate Heirs." Michael, 25, with a more athletic build from his college rowing days, scrolled through his phone, barely glancing at the market stalls. Christopher, the youngest at 23, actually seemed intrigued by the bustling marketplace, his hazel eyes, so like their mother's, taking in the colorful scene. "It's not terrible," Christopher murmured, inhaling the scent of fresh bread and flowers. "At least the coffee's decent." Their father, Richard Harper, CEO of Harper Investments, had insisted they spend time among real people after a board meeting where they dismissed concerns about worker conditions in one of their manufacturing plants. This excursion was his idea of teaching them empathy, one they were enduring only because their trust funds required regular proof of character development. "Let's just get something for the kitchen staff and go," Michael suggested, pocketing his phone. "Marta mentioned she needed strawberries for that dessert Father likes." As if summoned by his words, they spotted a humble strawberry stand at the end of the row. Unlike the other polished displays, this one was simply a wooden table with baskets of glistening red berries, tended by a young woman in modest, worn clothing. Her honey-brown hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and she worked with quick, efficient movements, serving customers with a smile that transformed her delicate features. "Perfect," James said, already bored. "We'll get the berries and then convince Father we've had our fill of real-world experiences for the month." They approached the stand as the crowd thinned, leaving them face-to-face with the strawberry seller. Up close, she was younger than she'd appeared from a distance, perhaps 20 or 21, with a sprinkle of freckles across her sun-kissed nose and remarkable amber eyes that seemed oddly familiar. "How much?" James asked, not bothering with pleasantries. The young woman looked up, those striking eyes meeting his. $8 for the small basket, 15 for the large. They were picked fresh this morning. $15 for strawberries? Michael scoffed. "Highway robbery for something you probably picked from someone else's field." Her smile faltered, but her voice remained steady. "I grow them myself, actually. Organic, no pesticides." Christopher, noticing a small scar near her hairline, partially hidden by her bangs, felt an inexplicable tug of recognition. He brushed it aside as the conversation deteriorated. "We'll take the large basket," James said, dropping a $50 bill on the table. "Keep the change. Maybe you can buy some clothes that don't look like they came from a donation bin." The young woman's hands stilled over the berries. Something flashed in those amber eyes, not just hurt, but a spark of defiance. "I don't need your charity," she said, pushing the bill back toward him, "and I certainly don't need fashion advice from someone who's probably never worked a day in his life." James blinked, unused to being challenged. "Do you have any idea who we are?" "Should I?" she countered, her chin lifting slightly. "We're the Harpers," Michael inserted, eyes narrowing. "As in Harper Investments, Harper Technology, Harper Media, the family that owns half the valley," she finished for him. "I know who you are, everyone does. That doesn't entitle you to be rude." Christopher, watching her closely, felt increasingly unsettled by her familiar mannerisms. The way she tilted her head when challenging them, the slight gesture of tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. It reminded him of someone, though he couldn't place who. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly, interrupting James's brewing retort. She hesitated, then answered, "Emma. Emma Sullivan." "Sullivan," James repeated with a smirk. "Not exactly a name that opens doors around here." Emma handed him the basket of strawberries with a tight smile. "We can't all be born with silver spoons, Mr. Harper. Some of us have to earn our way." As she extended her arm, her sleeve rolled up slightly, revealing a small birthmark on her wrist, a distinctive coffee-colored shape like a crescent moon. Christopher felt the air leave his lungs. That birthmark. He'd seen it before in family photos on the wrist of... "I think we're done here," James announced, taking the berries. "Enjoy your little stand, Emma Sullivan. Some free advice. Attitude doesn't sell berries." As they turned to leave, Christopher lingered, staring at Emma with growing disbelief. "That birthmark," he said quietly. "You've always had it?" Emma instinctively covered her wrist, surprised. "Yes." "Why?" "No reason," he said, but his mind was racing. "Thanks for the strawberries." Walking back to the car, Christopher couldn't shake the feeling that something momentous had just occurred. The birthmark, those amber eyes, the scar on her hairline, they all pointed to something impossible, yet increasingly undeniable. Back at their mansion over lunch on the terrace overlooking manicured gardens, Christopher couldn't focus on his brother's conversation. His thoughts kept returning to Emma Sullivan, the strawberry seller with their sister's eyes. 15 years ago, their youngest sibling, 6-year-old Emily Harper, had disappeared during a family vacation in Europe. The worldwide search had yielded nothing but dead ends and heartbreak. Their mother never recovered from the loss, fading away until cancer claimed her 5 years later. Their father became even more driven and cold, burying himself in work while raising his 3 sons to inherit his empire. They never spoke of Emily anymore. The east wing of the mansion, where her room remained untouched, was like a museum to grief that they all avoided. But now, Christopher couldn't ignore the striking similarities. The age would be right. The birthmark was identical, and those eyes, their mother's eyes. "I need to check something," he muttered, excusing himself from the table. In his father's study, he unlocked the desk drawer where old family albums were kept. Flipping through pages of happier times, he found what he was seeking: a close-up of Emily on her 6th birthday, laughing at the camera, her amber eyes shining and that same crescent birthmark visible on her small wrist. Christopher felt his heart pound. Could it really be possible? Had they just insulted their long-lost sister? And if Emma Sullivan was really Emily Harper, how had she ended up selling strawberries at a farmer's market with no knowledge of her true identity? The revelation hit Christopher like a physical blow. He sat alone in his father's study, the family album open on his lap, comparing the photograph of 6-year-old Emily with the mental image of Emma Sullivan. The similarities were too striking to be coincidental. The distinctive amber eyes, the crescent-shaped birthmark, even the small scar near the hairline that Emily had gotten from falling off her first bicycle. How was it possible? The private investigators their father had hired had scoured the globe for years. The ransom they'd expected never came. Eventually, the case went cold, and the Harpers buried their grief along with their hope. Christopher closed the album with trembling hands. He couldn't bring this to his brothers or father without being certain. James would dismiss it outright, and their father, Richard Harper, had hardened himself after losing both his daughter and wife. False hope would destroy what little humanity remained in him. "I need to know more about her," Christopher murmured, pulling out his phone. The next morning, Christopher returned to the farmer's market alone, deliberately dressed down in jeans and a plain button-up shirt. He spotted Emma immediately, arranging her strawberry display with care. Today she wore her honey-brown hair loose around her shoulders, making the resemblance to their mother even more pronounced. He approached casually, stopping to examine the berries. "These look even better than yesterday." Emma glanced up, recognition and wariness crossing her face. "Mr. Harper, back for more insults or just strawberries today?" "Christopher, please," he said, wincing at her tone. "And I wanted to apologize for my brothers. We were raised better than that." She studied him, surprise evident in her expression. "Apology accepted, I guess, though I'm not the only vendor they've treated that way." "I'm not surprised," Christopher admitted, "but I'm trying to be different." Emma's guarded expression softened slightly. "Well, points for effort. Would you like some strawberries, Christopher?" "Yes, and maybe some information." He leaned against her table. "How long have you been selling here?" 3 seasons now," she replied, filling a basket. "I rent a small plot outside town. It's not much, but the berries grow well there." "You mentioned you work alone?" Emma's movements slowed, suspicion returning. "Why all the questions?" "Just making conversation," he said quickly. "My family isn't big on small talk, if you couldn't tell." This earned a reluctant smile. "I live with my dad, adoptive dad," she clarified. "Frank Sullivan." He's been sick lately, so I'm handling the stand alone. Christopher's pulse quickened. Adoptive? Emma nodded, handing him the basket. He took me in when I was 7. I don't remember much before that. Accident when I was little. She touched the scar near her hairline unconsciously. Brain injury, some amnesia. The doctors said memories might return, but most never did. Each word confirmed Christopher's suspicions. A girl with amnesia, adopted 15 years ago. The timeline matched perfectly. That must have been difficult, he managed to say. Frank made it easier. He's a good man. Her expression clouded. That's why I need the stand to do well. His medical bills. She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. Anyway, that'll be $8. Christopher paid, deliberately avoiding leaving an excessive tip this time. I'd like to hear more about your farming operation sometime. Maybe I could stop by. Emma hesitated. Why would a Harper heir be interested in my little strawberry patch? He fumbled for a plausible explanation. I'm considering investing in small-scale organic farming. Father wants us to diversify our portfolio. Right, she said skeptically, but wrote her address on a small card. Saturday afternoon. I'll be harvesting. Christopher thanked her and left, his mind racing with possibilities. He needed more evidence before approaching his family, and he needed to understand Emma's situation better. If she truly was Emily, why hadn't Frank Sullivan come forward all those years ago? Was he involved in her disappearance, or merely a good Samaritan who found an injured child? Back at the Harper estate, Christopher carefully avoided his brother's questions about his morning whereabouts. Instead, he retreated to his private suite and made a call to Thomas Wallace, the family's head of security, who had been with them since before Emily's disappearance. I need a background check, Tom. Discreetly, Christopher explained. Frank Sullivan lives outside Westlake Village, has a daughter named Emma, probably adopted around 15 years ago. May I ask why? Thomas's voice carried the caution of someone who had witnessed the family's darkest times. Just a hunch about something. I'd rather not say more until I'm sure. Thomas agreed, his tone suggesting he understood more than Christopher was saying. I'll have preliminary information by tomorrow. True to his word, Thomas arrived at Christopher's door the next evening with a slim file. His weathered face betrayed nothing as he handed it over. Interesting reading, Mr. Christopher. Call me when you've gone through it. Christopher waited until he was alone before opening the file. Frank Sullivan, 62, had indeed adopted Emma 15 years ago. Before that, he'd been a respected doctor specializing in pediatric trauma. The adoption records showed Emma had been admitted to his hospital, a small facility in Northern California, hundreds of miles from where Emily had disappeared in San Francisco, as a Jane Doe with severe head trauma and no identification. According to the medical report, the child had been found wandering near a highway, disoriented and injured. No one had reported her missing in that jurisdiction. After 6 months with no leads on her identity, and with Emma forming a bond with the doctor who treated her, Frank Sullivan had applied for adoption. The paperwork appeared legitimate, but something felt off. Why hadn't the hospital connected the injured child to the high-profile Harper kidnapping case? Emily's face had been on national news for months. Christopher flipped through the remaining pages, then froze. A photocopy of Emma's original hospital intake form included a note about personal effects. Child found wearing distinctive silver bracelet W engraved initials EH and small charm in shape of strawberry. His hands began to shake. That bracelet had been a gift from their mother on Emily's 5th birthday, a playful reference to the child's obsession with strawberries, which she would eat by the bowlful when in season. It was one of the identifying items listed in all the missing person reports. Christopher closed the file, his suspicions now solidified into near certainty. Emma Sullivan was Emily Harper, his sister, and somehow she had ended up in the care of Dr. Frank Sullivan after her disappearance. Whether Sullivan had been involved in the kidnapping or had genuinely found an injured child remained unclear, but Christopher now had enough evidence to approach his family. But first he needed to see the strawberry charm bracelet. If Emma still had it, it would be irrefutable proof. Saturday couldn't come fast enough. Christopher found himself unable to concentrate during business meetings, earning concerned glances from James and irritated texts from their father. By the time he drove his modest Audi, chosen over the usual Ferrari to avoid drawing attention, toward Emma's address, his nerves were stretched to breaking point. The small farm sat on a gentle slope, with neat rows of strawberry plants stretching across an acre of land. A modest farmhouse stood at the edge of the property, its white paint peeling in places. It was worlds away from the Harper mansion. Yet as Christopher parked and caught sight of Emma kneeling among the plants, he felt an unexpected sense of rightness, as if a missing puzzle piece had finally been found. What he couldn't predict was how this revelation would shatter both their worlds, or how the truth about Emily Harper's disappearance would test the bonds of their fractured family. The warm afternoon sun beat down on Christopher as he made his way through the neat rows of strawberry plants. Emma glanced up from her harvesting, shielding her eyes with a gloved hand. She wore denim overalls over a simple t-shirt, her hair tied back in a practical ponytail, yet the family resemblance seemed even more striking in this setting. "You actually came," she called, surprise evident in her voice. "I half expected you were joking about the farm investment." Christopher smiled, navigating between the rows. "I'm serious about things that matter, more than she could possibly know." Emma gestured to a basket beside her. "Well, if you want to learn about strawberry farming, you can start by getting your hands dirty. These won't pick themselves." For the next hour, Christopher worked alongside her, listening as she explained the intricacies of organic farming, the challenges of pest control without chemicals, the importance of proper irrigation, the careful selection of plant varieties. Her knowledge was impressive, and her passion obvious. Occasionally their hands would brush as they reached for the same plant, and Christopher would feel a jolt of recognition. This was his sister, his family's missing piece. "You're not bad at this," Emma admitted as they carried full baskets toward a small shed. "For someone who probably has people to peel his grapes," Christopher laughed. "We're not quite that bad. Though I will admit this is my first time harvesting anything. So why the sudden interest in farming?" Emma set her baskets down on a wooden table. The truth this time. Christopher hesitated. He'd rehearsed this moment countless times, but now, facing her directly, words failed him. How did one tell a stranger that they might be long-lost siblings? "I'm interested in you," he said finally, then flushed at her raised eyebrow. "Not romantically. I think we might have met before, a long time ago." Emma's expression turned guarded. "I don't think so. I would remember meeting a Harper." "Not necessarily," Christopher ventured carefully. "You mentioned memory issues from your accident." Her hands stilled over the strawberries. "How much did I tell you about that?" "Not much," he admitted, "but enough to make me curious." He took a deep breath. "Emma, do you have any memories from before you were 7? Anything at all?" She frowned, the question clearly making her uncomfortable. "Flashes sometimes. Nothing solid. The doctors said that's normal with traumatic brain injuries." Her eyes narrowed. "Why are you asking me this?" Before Christopher could respond, a voice called from the farmhouse. "Emma, are those berries ready for market tomorrow?" They both turned to see an older man standing on the porch, thin and stooped, but with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. Frank Sullivan. "Almost done, Dad," Emma called back. To Christopher she whispered, "He has good days and bad days." "Today's good, thankfully." Frank made his way slowly down the porch steps. "You've brought a friend," he observed, extending a hand to Christopher. "Frank Sullivan. Christopher Harper," he replied, studying the man closely. Recognition flickered in Frank's eyes, followed by something Christopher couldn't quite identify. Worry, fear. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a genial smile. "Harper, you say? One of the Westlake Harpers?" "That's right," Christopher confirmed. "I've been learning about strawberry farming from your daughter." Frank's gaze shifted between them. "That's wonderful. Emma's quite the expert." He turned to her. "Honey, would you mind getting us some of that lemonade? Our guest must be thirsty after working in this heat." When Emma disappeared into the house, Frank's friendly demeanor evaporated. "What are you doing here, Mr. Harper?" he asked, his voice low and tense. Christopher met his gaze steadily. "I think you know exactly why I'm here, Dr. Sullivan. The silver bracelet with the strawberry charm. The initials E.H. Emily Harper." The color drained from Frank's face. "You can't prove anything," he whispered, "and you'll destroy her if you try. She's happy here." "Did you take her?" Christopher demanded, struggling to keep his voice down. 15 years ago in San Francisco?" Frank's eyes widened in genuine shock. "Take her? God, no, is that what you think?" He glanced anxiously toward the house. "I found her, injured and alone. By the time I realized who she might be, months had passed. She had bonded with me, was recovering well. The police had given up the search. So you decided to keep her?" Christopher's anger rose. "Do you have any idea what her disappearance did to our family? Our mother died of grief. I am truly sorry for your loss, Frank said, his voice cracking. But by then Emily, had already suffered one traumatic separation. The psychologists advised against another upheaval. He leaned closer. She had night terrors for years, Christopher. Would scream if anyone mentioned strawberries, though she couldn't explain why. Whatever happened before I found her left deep scars. Christopher faltered, unprepared for this perspective. But she loves strawberries now. The farm, years of gentle therapy, Frank explained, reclaiming the trauma. It was her idea to start the farm when she turned 18. He sighed heavily. I've lived with this decision every day, wondering if I did the right thing. But I loved her as my own. Still do. Before Christopher could respond, the screen door slammed, and Emma emerged carrying a tray with lemonade. You two look serious, she remarked, setting the tray down. Dad, you're not boring Christopher with medical stories, are you? Just getting acquainted, Frank said, his easy manner returning, though his eyes remained troubled. Emma poured the drinks, then reached for a small box on a shelf. Since you've worked so hard, you deserve to see something special, she told Christopher with a smile. My good luck charm. I always keep it in the shed when I'm working. She opened the box, revealing a tarnished silver bracelet with a strawberry charm. Christopher's breath caught in his throat. There it was, the final proof. It's beautiful, he managed to say. Where did you get it? I've always had it, apparently. Dad says I was wearing it when... She trailed off, glancing at Frank with a slight frown. Actually, I'm not sure I've ever heard exactly where it came from. Frank's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his lemonade. It was with your things at the hospital, remember? Emma's frown deepened. Was it? I thought... She shook her head. Never mind, it must be the heat affecting my memory. A tense silence fell, broken only when Emma's phone chimed. She checked it and sighed. Mrs. Delaney needs her weekly delivery now instead of tomorrow. I should go. She looked at Christopher. Would you mind helping Dad with the rest of the sorting? I won't be long. After Emma left in her old pickup truck, Christopher and Frank faced each other across the weathered table. She's starting to remember, isn't she? Christopher asked quietly. Frank nodded, his expression pained. Little things. Fragments. The doctors always said it might happen eventually. He looked at Christopher imploringly. What are you going to do now? Christopher stared at the bracelet Emma had left behind. I haven't decided yet, but my family deserves to know she's alive. And what about what Emma deserves? Frank challenged. To have her world turned upside down. To learn that her real family is one she's never known. One whose members, I might add, recently humiliated her in public. Christopher winced, remembering the farmer's market encounter. That wasn't our finest moment. No, it wasn't, Frank agreed grimly. Before you make any decisions, consider this. Emma has built a life here. She may not have wealth, but she has purpose and identity. Are you really prepared to shatter that? As the implications of his discovery continued to unfold, Christopher realized the truth was far more complicated than he had imagined. Finding Emily had been the easy part. Deciding what to do with that knowledge would prove infinitely more difficult. And unknown to both men, Emma had turned back to retrieve her forgotten bracelet, only to overhear words that would change everything she thought she knew about herself. Emma stood frozen at the edge of the shed, the words echoing in her mind like distant thunder. Emily Harper, real family, her world upside down. The bracelet, her bracelet, with the initials E.H. It all suddenly made terrible sense. You knew, she said, stepping into view. Both men jerked toward her, faces pale with shock. All this time, you knew who I really was. Frank rose unsteadily, reaching toward her. Emma, sweetheart, is that even my name? Her voice trembled, but her gaze remained steady. Or is it Emily Harper? Christopher stood as well, heart pounding. Emma, please let us explain. Explain what? That my entire life has been a lie? She looked between them, betrayal etched across her features. That I have brothers who mock me at farmers' markets? That my real father is some corporate tycoon who never found me? Her eyes fixed on Frank. Or that the man who raised me has been hiding the truth for 15 years? Frank seemed to age another decade before their eyes. I never meant to hurt you. Everything I did was to protect you. Protect me? Emma's laugh held no humor. From what? From wealth? From family? From more trauma? Frank said quietly. You were so broken when I found you, Emma. So frightened. The nightmares, the panic attacks. Whenever anyone mentioned strawberries or showed you pictures of them, you couldn't even explain why. He took a shaky breath. When I realized who you might be, months had passed. You were healing, calling me Dad. The psychologists advised against another upheaval. Emma's anger faltered, memories surfacing like bubbles in dark water. Nightmares of being held in darkness. A woman's angry voice, the smell of strawberries mixed with fear. Christopher watched the emotions cross her face, aching to reach out but knowing he had no right. "Emma," he said gently, "no one is asking you to decide anything right now. This is a shock for all of us." She turned to him, amber eyes, their mother's eyes, searching his face. "Why did you come looking for me? After all this time?" "I didn't. Not exactly," Christopher admitted. "It was chance that brought us together at the market. But once I saw the birthmark, your eyes, I had to know." Emma touched her wrist unconsciously, where the crescent mark had always been. "The coincidence seems impossible." "Perhaps it wasn't coincidence," Frank suggested softly. "Perhaps subconsciously you wanted to be found. You chose to sell strawberries, of all things, in a market near the Harper estate." Emma sank onto a bench, the weight of revelation heavy on her shoulders. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Christopher sat beside her, careful to maintain distance. "You're still you, Emma. Nothing changes that. Whether you're Emma Sullivan or Emily Harper, you're still the woman who built this farm, who cares for her father, who stands up to entitled jerks at farmers' markets." A ghost of a smile touched her lips at that. "One of whom turns out to be my brother." "All three, actually," Christopher said, "but I'd like to think I'm the least awful of the bunch." The tension broke slightly as Emma let out a small, reluctant laugh. Then she turned serious again, looking at Frank. "I need to know everything from the beginning." For the next hour in the quiet of the strawberry shed, Frank explained how he had found a small, injured girl wandering near a highway in Northern California, how she had been brought to his hospital with a severe concussion, unable to remember her name or where she came from, how he had eventually connected her to the Harper case, but by then had convinced himself that returning her would cause more psychological harm than good. "I told myself I was doing what was best for you," he finished, tears streaming down his weathered face. "But perhaps I was also being selfish. You became my whole world, Emma. My reason to keep going after your mother. My wife died." Emma listened in silence, tears tracking down her own cheeks. When Frank finished, she turned to Christopher. "And your mother? She's gone?" Christopher nodded sadly. 5 years after you disappeared. She never gave up hope of finding you, but the grief, it weakened her. When the cancer came, she didn't have the strength to fight." Emma closed her eyes, mourning a woman she couldn't remember. When she opened them again, determination had replaced confusion. "I want to meet them, my father, my other brothers, even if they're as awful as they seemed at the market. They're not so bad once you get to know them," Christopher said, then corrected himself. "Well, they're working on it. But are you sure? This doesn't have to happen right away." "I've lost 15 years, Emma said firmly. "I don't want to lose another day." The following afternoon found Emma standing at the imposing gates of the Harper estate, her heart threatening to pound out of her chest. Christopher stood beside her, a reassuring presence. Frank had wanted to come, but his health wouldn't allow it, a convenient truth that also gave Emma space to face this moment on her own terms. "Ready?" Christopher asked, his hand hovering near the intercom. Emma smoothed her simple blue dress, the nicest one she owned, yet still hopelessly out of place in these surroundings. "As I'll ever be." The drive to the main house seemed endless, the manicured grounds revealing the vast difference between Emma's life and what might have been. The mansion itself loomed like something from another world, her world, in another lifetime. In the grand entrance hall, James and Michael waited with identical expressions of confusion, having been told only that Christopher was bringing someone important to meet them. "What's going on?" James demanded, then froze as he recognized Emma. "The strawberry girl, Christopher, what is this?" But it was the older man descending the staircase who commanded the room's attention. Richard Harper, once robust and imposing, now carried himself with the careful dignity of one who has weathered unbearable loss. His hair had gone completely silver, his face lined with years of grief and responsibility. "Father," Christopher said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'd like you to meet Emma Sullivan, or as we once knew her, Emily Harper." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard gripped the banister, his knuckles white, as he stared at the young woman before him. Emma met his gaze steadily, though her hands trembled at her sides. "That's impossible," James whispered, but there was doubt in his voice as he studied Emma's features more carefully. Michael stepped closer, his earlier arrogance replaced by wonder. Those eyes, mother's eyes. Richard Harper descended the final steps like a man in a dream. He stopped before Emma, searching her face with desperate hope. "Emily?" he whispered. Emma reached into her pocket and withdrew the silver bracelet with the strawberry charm. "I've always had this," she said softly, "but I never knew what it meant." With shaking hands, Richard took the bracelet, turning it to reveal the engraving inside the band. "To our sweet Emily, with love that grows forever." Catherine's words, he murmured, tears filling his eyes. She chose them. Something broke in Richard then, years of carefully maintained composure crumbling as he reached for his daughter. Emma hesitated only a moment before stepping into his embrace, feeling an inexplicable sense of homecoming. Over her father's shoulder, Emma met the astonished gazes of her older brothers. James and Michael, who had mocked her only days ago, now stared at her as if seeing a ghost made flesh. "I guess," Emma said with a small, brave smile, "we have a lot of catching up to do." In that moment, as sunlight streamed through the grand windows of a home she couldn't remember, Emma Sullivan, once Emily Harper, and now perhaps something of both, realized that endings and beginnings were often the same thing. The harvest of her past had finally yielded its fruit, bitter and sweet together, like the first strawberry of spring.